Victory Over Violence, Digital Town Hall. A conversation about race in Arkansas.
Stop fighting! Stop fighting! You're gonna get tased! You're gonna get tased! Stop.
I can never imagine your pain or the depth of your anguish, but I can promise to fight for justice for all of our people.
Somebody love him. Like, regardless of how the officer felt about him or whatever, he was a man.
And I'm doing everything I'm told to do. And we still are looked at as easy prey, easy targets.
The overwhelming number of officers in this nation are good people, working hard, trying to keep order in the communities.
I'm announcing a new order today regarding neck restraints, commonly called chokeholds.
Things that we used to do, even as recent as last week, we cannot still do some of those same things.
We need to have the conversation, not with just our black and brown moms and kids. White people need to have that conversation. I don't want to see another traumatizing video.
Welcome to our Victory Over Violence Digital Town Hall, Policing in Arkansas, Trust and Accountability. I'm Donna Terrell. As we've seen in the last few weeks, the conversation on the state of policing in America is shifting. The protest, the movement has sparked changes here and around the country. It's an emotional topic that tackles the question, how do we mend the relationship between the police and the community? Tonight, our focus is on communities in Arkansas. Joining me for this town hall are attorney Richard Mays of Mays Burden Associates, who is also a former state Supreme Court justice. Jamie Cook, secretary of the Arkansas Department of Public Safety and a member of the newly formed Governor's Law Enforcement Task Force. Chris Danford is a member of Grassroots Arkansas, a protest group. Wesley Peters, also a protester, and runs a nonprofit called Conducting Creativity. And Sergeant Willie Davis with the Little Rock Police Department and head of the OK Our Kids program. I want to thank you all for joining me for this. There seems to be a disconnect between the community and police. In a recent Axios Ipsos poll, only 36% of blacks said they trust the police. Compare that to 77% of white respondents. So, Wesley and Chris, I want to begin with you two on this question. Why do you think there is mistrust and what can be done to change it? Wesley, why don't you start?
How's everybody doing today?
We're doing great.
That's good. Good, Wes. We're good, Wes. How you doing, brother?
Yeah, for sure. Happy Juneteenth, everybody. So, I think the mistrust begins with the misunderstanding of industry. I think if we really break down industry into capitalism and really get into what capitalism means and what it breaks down to on a social and intersocial level, we can start answering a lot of these questions. Just take this campaign, for instance, to start off with and look at industry, look at media, how media runs industry. So every click and every swipe, every time somebody puts Black Lives Matter on Instagram, it now becomes Instagram's movement. So when we break down industry and where Black people play in pieces of industry in terms of ownership, we can start understanding a lot of these complex issues.
Okay. Chris, I want to hear from you on the question, why do you think there's a breakdown and such a mistrust between blacks and the police compared to whites and police?
Well, I can only speak to my experience. I think that people who look like me, have historically had a very different experience. One of the very real things that we're seeing with these protests across the entire nation, if you pay attention, you'll see there's a common pain there because everybody has had common experiences, and that's there have been times I've been pulled over, and a lot of my anxiety with it regarding how am I going to pay for this ticket. My anxiety didn't come from a place where I knew people who had been taken out of their communities, out of their homes, whether through over incarceration, over policing, or even violence. And so I think there's a big discrepancy in the experiences between white people and black people. And I think that's something that, white people also haven't done a good job at listening to the expressions and to the communication of those experiences. There's not been any period of time where Black people have been silent about how they were being treated and their experiences, and it's frankly been on white people who have been ignoring.
Yeah, and I know one of the things you have said, Chris, is that part of your experience, especially with the protesters, is trying to help more white people understand what's going on. We have Sergeant Willie Davis, who's up right now. He's still adjusting his camera, and he's in the car. Sergeant Davis, this week, police chief in Little Rock announced the ACT plan, accountable, clear, transparent. It is supposed to help with de-escalation situations. Do you think that this can help with some of the mistrust issues with blacks? And I believe Willie Davis's his picture has frozen. Over the years, we have seen changes made to policing and practices within police departments across the country following the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri back in 2014. Then President Barack Obama enacted the Task Force on 21st Century Policing. The Little Rock Police Department adopted the 21st Century Policing Standard following 6 pillars: trust and legitimacy, technology and social media, community policing and crime reduction, training and education, and officer safety and wellness. Do we have Sergeant Davis back? I don't think we have him back yet. So Jamie Cook, I want to ask you about this. With changes that are happening in police departments, do you think that kind of change makes sense?
Yes, I absolutely think it makes sense. I think that as law enforcement and a community, we all have to humbly listen to each other and to seek to understand. I think that any time that we can improve on what we're doing, which is we can always improve, then it's only going to benefit the community and law enforcement.
I'm wondering, though, about the training. Part of your office, you train most of the police officers in the state. Does any of that training involve community policing?
Yes, it does.
How
and
so?
we have several different blocks of instruction just in the basic police academies, and then I know that the departments themselves do a lot of community-based policing. Every block of instruction that we do in our law enforcement training academies emphasizes ethical policing. So I think that always relates back to those community models. In 2017, Act 423 was passed, and that made a requirement for all police officers in their basic training to receive that crisis intervention training. And again, I believe that all of those types of trainings relate back to the true reason for policing, and that is to protect and serve our communities.
Mr. Mays, you've been involved with civil rights. You have a history of filing lawsuits against police. The officers involved in the Rayshard Brooks shooting in Atlanta were just recently arrested and charged, but some question if they will ever be convicted. So with that in mind, do you think that there needs to be changes in the legal system, and if so, what?
Well, I think you got to start with the attitude that most of these policemen have. We came from a system where the police were in charge of enforcing uneven policies, especially in the Black community. And they were not the higher trained persons. They weren't paid very much. And they come from that part of the community that views their role as keeping Blacks in their place. So when you try cases in an environment like that, where you have a jury, which in many instances was particularly exclusively white, and they make an effort to keep Blacks off of juries, you're not getting an objective view of the critical issues. Mm-hmm. And that, together with the lack of education and the lack of training and the lack of significant pay. I mean, we are charging these officers with a great responsibility, but we are paying them like they don't have significant responsibility. I view officers much like I view teachers. They carry some of the greatest responsibilities that government can put on the regular citizen, and training and the right to take a life and the ability to take a life, in my opinion, requires a certain level of preparation and maturity.
Wesley, do you agree with that?
Yes, ma'am. I think it definitely starts in many of the points that Mr. Mays made, but I think it needs to be a deeper look into the program of what it really means to be a community police, right? So I love the model of the OK program and Sergeant Willie Davis actually going into communities, and police are policing the community. That it's a holistic job and it's a holistic approach. So I definitely agree. I think we can take it a step further in what we require out of community policing and what we require in the intensives and in the trainings, and in preparing people for a multicultural world. So yes, ma'am, definitely.
Chris, from your perspective, and you and I have had discussions about this, one of the things you said you like to do is to reach out to other white people and draw them in and make them understand what's going on. But when we talk of issues such as this and the legal system and some of the challenges that have been dealt with for years, do you connect with that and understand it and feel like there need to be some changes?
Well, I think when you talk about the law, the ideal is fair laws enforced justly. So these are systems that work for everybody, and I think that we have a lot of systems that aren't working particularly well for anybody. Mr. Mays touched on what we're asking of police officers, and I want to pull just a couple of things together for you, just kind of emphasize that. If y'all remember the incident in McKinney, Texas in 2015 that went viral, where a police officer was called by a neighbor to basically calm some kids down. And he showed up and he jumped out of his car and immediately slammed a 14 or 15-year-old girl to the ground. She was a young Black girl, and this made national news. But the story that didn't make national news was that officer was coming off of a scene where he had to work a suicide, I believe by gunshot, which is a very traumatic thing. And so I don't believe that there's no place where somebody can have those two responsibilities. Those are not the right tools for the job. And we were asking this officer to do something that ended up very tragically. It was a horrible miscarriage of justice, where he ends up assaulting, my words, this young girl. But we were also not taking into account the other things we're asking him to do in the same afternoon.
Well, I think I know where you're headed with this, and I think we're going to get into that particular issue in just a bit. Okay. Many people have called for law enforcement agencies to make changes to their use of force policies. Two big issues: no-knock warrants and the use of chokeholds. Little Rock Mayor Frank Scott Jr. issued an executive order banning chokeholds by the LRPD. President Trump also signed an order that includes a credentialing system he says will lead to banning chokeholds unless an officer's life is at risk. Jamie, the governor's law enforcement task force was created to analyze procedures and law enforcement in Arkansas. How will you work to actually translate that into actual policies that will be seen and felt in the community?
Thank you for the question. And the president's task or president's order parallels with all of the policies that I'm aware of in Arkansas. So we should look at every policy that we have in Arkansas, chokeholds, use of force, and every other thing to make sure that those policies are good enough to guide law enforcement behavior. I love what Mr. Mays and Chris talked about with law enforcement. Thank you for those comments, because it's oftentimes that we ask police officers to do so much, and we have an expectation in law enforcement or as a society for very high quality law enforcement officers, which we absolutely should have that expectation. but we also as a society have to invest in that expectation, because anytime you have a disparity between your investment and your expectation, there's going to be problems. And I think that we're well aware of those problems now. Well, Donna, I know I got off subject a little bit. I get really passionate about this, but the resiliency efforts, the training efforts, the educational opportunities, the compensation and benefits package for law enforcement officers in Arkansas, we have got to take a really good look at that and make sure that that investment from our society into law enforcement meets the expectations that we all have, which is very high.
You know, and I feel like we're kind of heading into the whole defunding issue, which we will get to in just a minute and explain what exactly that means. Chris, there are 4 citizens activists on the governor's task force. Do you think they represent what your protest group is asking for?
Frankly, I can't speak for any other citizens. I haven't spoke to them about this issue.
Okay.
I know by reputation, several of them have very good reputations.
Okay, what about you, Wesley? Do you think that this group represents what you would like to see and the protesters who you walk with side by side?
We haven't had a comprehensive meeting having to do with what we're expecting and what we're trying to see. Out of this, I can only speak for my personal self and those around me every day. And I understand and agree with everything that everybody is saying, and kind of to go into what I mean by programming. Mental health. We should definitely start looking in that. So let's look at it in the industries of education and then in the industries of community policing. So when you look at that, the numbers are disproportionate there also. So having access to a therapist. So when you see an incident where somebody is drastically murdered, you're there to talk about your problems with a therapist. You're there to get your problems out. Same thing in school. Our schools, especially south of 630, are heavily policed. It's more police in our school for the most part than mental health therapists in proportion to students. So if we start looking at those things and how they parallel, let's start helping to create better people in society. Let's put that in some type of program. Let's put that into intensives.
Okay, and Sergeant Davis, we have you back now. Your thoughts on what Wesley just said there?
Man, I missed a whole lot, man. I want to comment on some more stuff too, but I hear what Wesley is saying. I want to also touch on. They mentioned earlier about we have so much to do, expect to do as police officers. Well, in the academy, we understand and know what our job entails. One of the biggest things our job entails is that we can kill or be killed. That's number one. But what we experience out on the streets in terms of call loads and calls like things like that, we experience in our own families. So you'd be hard pressed to find a cop that don't have alcoholism in their family, mental health in their family, domestic abuse in their family. So we know what that looks like. There's nothing hard about responding to those kinds of issues. The hard part is you having a heart and empathy for people. That's the big thing right there. You have to be able to have empathy for the people that you are serving, not dealing with.
Well, you know what? And I totally, I think a lot of people will agree with that, but can you say every officer feels that way? Or every officer has that kind of empathy?
Not at all. And that goes back to recruitment, Donna. That goes back to some serious look at how we recruit these people that want to be police officers. You're absolutely right. No, that doesn't mean that. And that's one of the bigger issues too, because we have to be more intensive in who we are interviewing, what we're asking them doing interviews, and see where they're coming from. Diversity question.
And yes. You've touched on something that has come up while you were gone, because Mr. Mays was talking about how we don't pay officers enough. And Jamie, I know recruitment falls in your territory as well in terms of the state, does it not?
We don't hire officers out of the law enforcement standards and training. That's with the individual departments, but it certainly is. Officer Davis is absolutely right. We have a problem recruiting those good, high quality officers as well. Yesterday, when we had our first task force meeting, Chief Percy Wilburn in Lake Village, Arkansas, told the task force that he had a vacancy in Lake Village Police Department for 1 year with 0 qualified applicants. So that's a very, very big part of this study is who are we recruiting, but are we getting enough good applicants to fill the need for law enforcement?
Right. And Mr. Mays, this really does go back to what you were saying earlier, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I'm just saying we from my standpoint, I've seen so many different environments. The environment has certainly changed. Just the level of minority participation in law enforcement has been a major change in the context of what we're dealing with now.
Okay.
My first job out of law school was with the Justice Department as a lawyer. After I left the Justice Department, I was recruited by the FBI. And the FBI at that time required you to have a law degree or CPA certification. So those requirements also require much more significant compensation.
Right, much more significant compensation. Let's move on here. Here's a comment we received on our Facebook page. Daniela writes, the former Minneapolis officer, Derek Chauvin, who is charged with killing George Floyd, and former Atlanta officer Garrett Wolf, charged in Rayshard Brooks's killing, had complaints in their file. She says she thinks officers need to be reevaluated if they have multiple complaints. Sergeant Davis, I want to ask you about this. And before you answer, I should also add the president's executive order is calling for a national database tracking officers with multiple reports of misconduct. Your thoughts on this?
It's almost irritating, quite frankly. When you talk about records in the background, let's go back to supervision. And you're right. You have an officer that has, I think in the Chauvin's case, he had 16 or 17 complaints that were unfounded, and that's because we are policing ourselves. If there's a complaint on me or any other officer in the police department, I get investigated by my own officers, by my own fellow co-workers. And so you can always have their problem. Then you have supervisors that are leaning more toward the police side as opposed to doing the right thing. And so that's the issue that goes to supervision. So we have to monitor case by case these officers and then take a more serious look at the complainants. Because what also happens is if I'm Chauvin and I get away with 5 complaints, I'm gonna keep on doing it as long as I know that I'm gonna be okay. And that's what you look at. So they feel like they're not being disciplined and they're doing the right thing, and that's not always the case.
Self-policing has been something the protesters have definitely been talking about. Chris, any thoughts on that?
I mean, you know, I would love to be the person to investigate myself whenever I've messed up on the job. That doesn't sound, that's not true accountability. And additionally, if we have an atmosphere where there's a us versus them mentality, with the them being primarily, Black citizens, then the them will always lose.
Right. Jamie, how do you fix that?
I think what Officer Davis just said, we have to have that supervision and that good leadership in those departments, and then the department administrators, the chiefs, the sheriffs, the law enforcement administrators, when they have an officer that they're terminated, they need to, and they do. We have had a significant increase in decertifications in the state of Arkansas over the years. 0 in 1998, 40 last year that we've decertified. And I think that's not because we have more bad officers. That's because we have better accountability. And in Arkansas, when you're decertified forever. You can no longer be a police officer in the state of Arkansas if you're decertified. If you're decertified in another state in our country, you cannot come to Arkansas and be a police officer. We participate in the National Decertification Database, and we have a database that tracks all of that. So that accountability is incredibly important.
And I think that's great. But go ahead. I'm sorry, Sergeant Davis.
I want to make a point too, because you mentioned before I got cut off about an act. Is that the chief is mentioned acronym ACT? I think you said it was. Yes. And when I think about things like that, it's almost like we are reacting to something. But if you remember, Obama initiated a 21st century policing deal back in 2014 that had 7 tenets. And so now we're here in 2020 and we still haven't fully implemented those tenets. And that concerns me because we want to react when something happens. If we were using those things, we wouldn't be here.
Well, you know, it's very interesting because when we lost your signal, we were talking about that, his 21st century, several things that came out of that, and part of it was community policing, and that was something I was going to ask you about. Have we really made strides in that? I know you're very much involved in community policing, but you know, how big of a deal is it in LRPD in general?
It's not. It goes back to what I said earlier about leadership and supervision. It has to come from the top. The chief, whoever that person is in charge, has to say with his mouth, "This is the direction we're going in. I'm embracing this philosophy, and I'm trusting and hoping that my officer will follow behind me, and we're going to institute this thing." Now, the next thing is that you do with that is you listen. You listen to what the community has to say, what their concerns are. Then we form a partnership relationship with these individuals to say, "Look, we want to work together with you to help you solve the crimes and field crimes in your communities and your neighborhoods. We want to work with you." And so then you form the partnership. But there has to be action that takes place consistently, not something that happens as a response to something. It has to be already ongoing. Okay. And that's what true community policing is.
Okay. Being stopped by the police can be a stressful situation. Now many cities are considering pulling police back from responding to calls that have little to do with violent activity. Wesley, do you think sending an unarmed trained professional to a situation instead of an armed officer can alleviate anxiety?
It could. Let's define how we are saying train though. Who is this person coming to my car? So it could. I think definitely we need to take more tactical steps in how police answer calls, how police just respond in general. But yes, it could.
Okay. South Carolina Republican Tim Scott is leading a proposed crime legislation. It's called the Justice Act. In an opinion piece in USA Today, he said, "Like many other Black Americans, I have found myself choking on my own fears and disbelief when faced with the realities of an encounter with law enforcement." Officer Davis, is there a way to interact with police that could calm some fears?
Yes, that's absolutely. One of those things is, and when you start at an early age, putting police officers in our schools, we're talking about elementary schools, forming those kind of relationships, putting police officers in the communities where they can actually engage with their citizens on bicycles, doing things in the community on a regular basis, community fest, neighborhood fest, those kinds of things, that visit churches, our local churches. So form some type of relationship that's ongoing and connect with a neighborhood group.
I guess the question is, I mean, all of this is great advice, but why isn't it being done? Why hasn't it started? Why are we having this discussion about something that sounds like it makes a lot of sense and could be easy to do?
Look, because people are not willing to have those frank, honest, open discussions about what we're talking about now. That's why.
All right.
Yes.
According to the ACLU, 7 in 10 blacks say they are treated less fairly than whites in their dealings with police. Mr. Mays, this was happening when you were defending clients back in the 70s. Has anything gotten better?
Well, I think it has gotten better. If you just take a look at the Little Rock Police Department. When I filed a suit in a case called Phillips v. Weeks back in 1972, which was tried in 74 and 75, I think there were only about 2 African-American policemen, Johnny Gilbert and a Mr. Hunter. So just the involvement of diversity in the department alone, in my opinion, has given greater confidence in the police. And you need members in the community. There was at one point in time a requirement that police officers come from the community that they serve. In Little Rock, I remember on the city council, that issue was debated because a lot of policemen from Little Rock were from Cabot, Arkansas at that time. And there was a belief that there was just not an identity with the problems and the history and the personality and the challenges that Little Rock citizens, certainly Black citizens, had experienced in Arkansas. So, but yes, I think things are substantially better. I mean, you got a black police chief in Little Rock, Arkansas.
Okay.
You got you got a complaint, civilian complaint procedure. When I filed suit, there was no civilian complaint procedure.
Right. Okay. All right. You know what, Chris, I do want to talk with you a little more about your stance and your position. What exactly is it that your protest group is asking for?
That's a broad question. I think we are asking for the full humanization, full human rights of all of our citizens. And how we get there is a pretty broad thing. Some of it starts with reallocating resources from the police to people who are better able to carry out the requirements of the community. At the very core of it, we believe that the power that the police have flows from the community that they're supposed to serve. And not just same as the power of the state, same as the power of law. So full democracy. And we want, when there is law enforcement required, we want the people carrying that out to look like the people that they are serving. And I want to just back up to something that the sergeant said. He mentioned putting people in places, and I think that Mr. Mays got it when he said that there used to be residency requirements, and I think that that's being from the communities that you are serving would be a major step. I think that professionalizing the force would be a major step as well.
And I'm just going to jump in here and just say this because we've reported on this a lot, that sometimes the pool in which to choose from in the community is not large enough. So the argument that you hear from many is that you have to go outside of Little Rock to find, quote unquote, enough qualified people.
Well, let me ask you that. Is there another $80 million business in the city of Little Rock that doesn't influence our local universities to train up their future employees?
Good point.
I would think that that would be if I were in charge of the whole city, that would be one thing that would work to facilitate is this professionalization and education of people from our communities. It's not that people don't want to be educated and have jobs. It's not that people don't want to serve their communities. But
okay. Officer Davis, do you agree with that? Are there, can we find enough qualified police officers within the city?
Almost definitely. Yes, indeed. Here's the issue is I find more qualified individuals not wanting to be a police officer because of how they view us. That's the bigger issue. Is that they're not interested in being an officer because they see what's going on across the country and the adversarial relationship that's been with the police and the community for so long. So they're intimidated about coming over. I can remember several young guys that I had as a community officer. They wanted to be a police officer and they changed their minds, or they got in the process and they were thrown out for some kind of reason and bogus stuff. Okay. So it's not that we can't find any. No, it's that they don't want to do this work now. It's tough finding those that want to do it.
Got it. The defunding police cry has grown louder in recent weeks. Several polls have shown not many people are in favor of defunding police, but they do support putting more money into different areas like housing and education. There are 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the U.S. According to the Urban Institute, state and local governments spent $115 billion on policing in 2017. $79 billion went to correction systems. Arkansas was one of the states with the lowest spending per capita on police protection. Jamie, why is that?
Back to what I said earlier is that our expectations high and our investments low. And in the state of Arkansas, a police officer to retire at full benefits is about 35 years. So, we've got to look at, like Sergeant Davis said, people don't really want to be police officers anymore. So how are we going to get those good, high quality police officers to live in their communities? And I'd love for them to be from their communities. Percy Wilburn in Lake Village would love that as well. How are we going to get those high quality officers in those areas? That is something that is critical for our society in Arkansas and across this nation to look at, that if we want these good, high quality officers to do what I think everybody wants officers to do, then are we willing to make the investment to have that? And I think the answer is yes. I think that this panel kind of proves that we all have that expectation. And so we need to roll up our sleeves and get busy and see what that needs to look like and what kind of investment we need to make it happen.
All right. You know, we're at
Hey, Donna.
Go right ahead.
Hey, Donna, in I think it was 97, I was involved in what we call a Cop Next Door program. At that time, I actually was paid to buy a house in the inner city, Central High neighborhood, as a cop. It was called Cop Next Door through Bank of America back then. And so I lived there for years in the community where I served because of that. I got a good deal on the house. I sure did.
Chris,
I lived for 25 years. I lived for 25 years in the community where I served.
And it sounds like we need more programs like that. And that, you know, and Jamie, you touched on it, not just here, but across the country, where people feel that they are invested in their community and where they get to know the people that they serve, and the people who are being served by officers also know who's serving and protecting them. Chris, you looked as though you wanted to comment on that.
I think so. I'm going to expand this from Little Rock specifically to Arkansas. I do think that we have a very serious issue with funding, not just the law enforcement aspect of our society, but a lot of the building blocks of our society, including our public school system. And that if we're taking a look at, if we're talking about educating and hiring police officers, we also have to look at the entire ecosystem. So that would include the school to prison pipeline. We know that a lot of, we've seen a rise in private prisons in our nation, and Arkansas is included in that. And we know that the way that they order beds for the future is through their grade reading rates. We know that, young Black children are suspended and punished at much higher rates. That eventually leads to, truancy, low reading rates, and eventually prison. And I think you have to look at the entire ecosystem and fully embrace and fund these building blocks that make. When you say Black Lives Matter, you have to look at the entirety of Black life and the ecosystems that it exists in.
I follow what you're saying. You know, we're at the end of our program. One final question, but Richard, your question is a little different because we have two protesters on the panel. They are part of what's being called a movement, a Black man and a white man. You've been involved in civil rights movements in your past. Any advice for them in terms of the movement, because they are entrenched in it right now as we speak?
Well, I've seen in this recent protest more diversity than I've ever seen, and I was somewhat surprised by that level of diversity. I think the Floyd killing was just so egregious that it touched the souls of many, many people. I mean, it took almost an evil mind to just put a knee on a man's neck and keep it there for almost 9 minutes and not be concerned about that person as a human being. And the type of mindset that it takes to relate to that is pretty difficult to contemplate when you put a gun with that mindset. So, it's the quality. People have to recognize that we get what we pay for. And if we don't start paying these police officers a lot more, we're not going to get much better quality.
Okay, so
and that's a major part of the issue, in my opinion.
Your advice to them, though, in terms of the movement, any advice at all, quickly?
Well, my advice is that the level of intensity is here. I think this is a moment to take advantage of that and to reach out and continue to work with people from all walks of life. I think this has touched so many people that the opportunity to bring about change is now.
Okay,
and those people who are leading that ought to be more aggressive about bringing in those people from a different part of the community.
And I think that's happening here for sure. We have representation of that right here on this panel. For the rest of you, if this could happen today, what is the next step to take to build relationships between police and the community? Chris?
Again, I think you have to take a look at what the community wants. I think that, again, fair laws enforced justly. I think that's impossible without good legislation. I think it's impossible without people from the community who are really invested in serving their brothers and sisters and family and friends.
Okay, Jamie, your thoughts on that?
We just have to prioritize humanity, common humanity, human values, and align those goals and move forward from there.
Wesley, your thoughts?
We have to take an intentional look at who we're hiring and why. And in terms of the community, we have to truly care for the community and put intentional resources into the community that will further that community along. Intentional resources, connections throughout the Black communities, if we want to see the change that we're looking for.
Okay, and Sergeant Davis, we're going to end it with you. Your thoughts, if today we could make a change right this very moment, what would it be? And I believe you're muted. You're muted.
I'm sorry. Okay, Donna. What I was saying was, right now, I think if our leaders, the chief of police, the mayor, the city board of directors, the FOP, the Black Police Association, if we were intentional and took a commitment to sit in a room and talk this thing over and say, we're tired of this, we're not going to tolerate this, and we're going to work together, and the community going to see us working together, making this thing work. That's what should happen.
Okay.
I believe that.
I want to thank our panelists for being with us. Thank you so much for joining me on our Victory Over Violence Town Hall. We hope to keep this conversation going. Again, panelists, thank you for being here for this open and honest conversation. We appreciate all of your input. I'm Donna Terrell. So long, everybody. We'll see you next time.